But hey,
Well,
Bob, I want to, if I can add to that, I'm really glad you brought up the fact about that because I think it has a bigger significance, even outside of baseball. It leads still to a current modern day problem, which, John and Danny, thank you so much, and Crawley for speaking up on this, for standing with us in America to finally say enough is enough. And so when you think about it, that same story is juxtaposed across Black culture. We build all of these institutions for ourselves and for our families and our children and our communities because we're isolated and we're segregated from other institutions and from, the economy and being a part of this. And so, for example, Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, we know about that massacre. But when you examine what happened there, you look in Chicago and Bronzeville after the Great Migration, some of the greatest minds and legends in Chicago have lived in Bronzeville, came here, right? Musicians, artists, intellectuals, ball players. Bronzeville, from all accounts, was the place to be if you were Black. Now it's 2020. Bronzeville is trying to make a comeback, but it's so bad here, Bob. That point, we used to call it the low end. And you Chicago guys know what I'm talking about. Nobody wanted to go down on 35th and State Street if you weren't going to a White Sox game because you had Stateway Garden projects there. You had other projects, and and it was just kind of a dismal place. And you would not have known this significant and great history about all of this success in the Black community if people didn't preserve those oral histories and stories and try to pass them along. So you really do see a pattern, an egregious pattern that has, really happened to Black people as a result of segregation and us building our institutions. And then when integration occurs, it flattened a lot of things for us. And so, I just want to mention it because that is still it is really a big factor and a contributing factor to the socioeconomic conditions of Black Americans, not just in Chicago, but all around this country. If you start looking in Black communities and cities, you should see that something is going on and say, wait a minute, something just ain't right.
well, and to your point, Levante, you can go back, and I tell people all the time, you can trace the rise and fall of the Negro Leagues with the rise and fall of Black economy in this country. And to a great extent, Black economy never recovered from losing the Negro Leagues. So
Right.
again, what was good morally, what was good socially, was devastating economically. And you see, wherever you had successful Black baseball, you had thriving Black economies. And to hear Buck O'Neill and Ernie and my dear friend, late great Ted Double Duty Ratcliffe, who lived and died in Chicago at 103. Yeah, he died in 2005. He was a fixture over at White Sox ballpark. And to hear those guys talk about what the South Side of Chicago was like, man, you just wish you could go back in time and be there. And Levante mentioned the great East West All Star Classic, debuted in 1933, the same year that Major League Baseball's All Star Game debuted. And yes, it did outdraw Major League Baseball's All Star Game because he's right. They would put over 50,000 fans in Chicago's Comiskey Park for that showcase event, one of the greatest sporting events in American sports history that nobody knows anything about. And Buck O'Neill says that Black folks would come from as far west as Los Angeles by train, as far south as New Orleans, as far east as New York, converging on Chicago for this showcase event. They stand on the south side. Yeah, they all stand on the south side. And so you can kind of get an understanding of how special the south side was. Or here in Kansas City, where the museum is located, historic 18th and Vine. Same thing. One of the, I think 18th and Vine is one of the most recognized street cross sections anywhere in the world because that intrinsic mixture of jazz and baseball that radiated from
Yes.
this street corner. And anybody who was anybody, particularly in the world of jazz, they could get a gig in Kansas City when they couldn't get a gig anywhere else because all the restaurants had live music, all the hotels had live music, and you had nightclubs galore right here in this area that my office is right now. And when we built this museum, it was part of an effort to try and revitalize historic 18th and Vine, who, like a lot of urban areas, LaVonte, had died and been left abandoned until we built this museum here 30 years ago as an effort to resurrect this once very proud, prominent African-American community.
And my granddaddy would tell me stories about that, man. And he would say, you thought the game was something. You should have seen the nightlife down in Bronzeville, because you could just be walking around and bump into all of these stars. You know, you'd be at a jazz club and Louis Armstrong is playing at night. And, you know, you got names are escaping me right now, but, you know, you see some of the famous actors and actresses for that time, and they'd be in Chicago. So you're right, Bob. Everybody descended on Chicago for that game, and it was just, you know, according to my elders, it was just a blast for a couple of days, you know, here on the South Side, specifically down in Bronzeville. You know, it was a big family coming together around baseball.
And you have to understand, segregation is one of the most shameful things to ever happen in this country's history. But what segregation did was it forced ownership. So the degree of ownership that was so prevalent in those African-American communities, I'm not sure we will ever see that again. Here in Kansas City, Black folks could only move within a 13-block radius. 13 blocks, couldn't go outside those 13 blocks. But man, within those 13 blocks, you had everything you need. Yeah, and more. And I think what we saw was, you saw other folks coming in to this area to enjoy that nightlife and these great musicians. I'll never forget, Buck tells a wonderful story. He says the Monarchs had played here in Kansas City on a Saturday, and they were all going to go home, John. They were going to get cleaned up, get dressed, and they're going to come back to a nightclub here at 18th and Vine called the Subway. Well, it was called the Subway because the club was actually below street level. And so as Buck is telling the story, said they all sitting around in the nightclub, sipping on a little tea. When a kid walks in, he's got a horn over his shoulder, he wants to blow. Everybody say, let him blow. Well, Buck said his kid gets up on the stage, he starts making some noises out of this horn they never heard before, but you had to pay attention. That kid was a young Charlie Yardbird Parker. You know, so that's the kind of star power that we're talking about. Louis Armstrong had his own semi-pro Black baseball team. Cab Calloway had his own semi-pro Black baseball team. And so I tell people all the time, all the jazz musicians wanted to be baseball players. All the baseball players wanted to be jazz musicians. So fitting that they came together here at historic 18th and Vine.
Man,
and all the backup catchers wanted to be pitchers, right, John?
Well, this is blowing my mind. You know, as Danny knows, my brother's a musician, and when he was in Chicago, he went and studied at Northwestern music performance, plays the trombone, and when he was in Chicago, he played in the Clarence Cockrell band, and got to play with Clarence. And I think about just like these parallels of the relationship between performance, right, which is my job now, which is focusing on helping people perform better, and how these things go from how the athlete can identify with the musician and vice versa. And then again, thinking about ownership, like we're talking about. I remember, I think it was last year or the year before, Killer Mike, the musician, came out with a TV show, and he did a whole episode on the dollar and where the dollar goes in and out of the community. And it was things like that where I you know, at almost 40 years old, when I watch something like that, and I go, how the hell did I not know about this? Like, I consider myself somebody that tries to stay abreast to like the current things that go on, but it's just so hard to like, absent of having conversations like this and having access to Bob, Kendrick, and to LaVonte, who's, you know, people who are, but you guys are leading change in the community, but doing it by, like, in one case, exposing the actual history to everybody, but then also, LaVonte, in your case, like, devoting your life to making things change. I hope that what we're talking about here gets to a lot of people. I'm going to hope that the Cubs do that. And further, I'm gonna cause some problems now and make some stinks about this is how I do my job. I spot things that I don't like, and then I just tell as many people as possible until something changes. And it's actually worked over my last 5 years of my career here with the Cubs. But the fact that we don't have we don't do anything like specifically to honor Buck O'Neil, especially in this time, like. That's the first word that comes to my mind, or the first feeling that I notice as I kind of mindfully think about what's going through my body right now is embarrassment. Mm-hmm. It's embarrassing. Our treatment of this in our country. I mean, the fact that it takes what it took for me to watch on TV a while ago when that video came out from Minnesota. The fact that it took me seeing that, having to see that to finally go like, that's it. You know, like we have this day where, you know, Danny and the bleacher fans have put together this thing, and we've always tried to raise money for the community. But the fact that it took that, like, again, it's still what I feel most is embarrassed, and kind of simultaneously hearing this information, I also feel hopeful.